Thanksgiving is a tradition during which Canadians gather to eat and count their blessings. But some say it's time to rethink how it's celebrated given its colonial history. Jacqueline Romanow is an associate professor in Indigenous Studies at the University of Winnipeg and joins us. Professor Romanow, good to have you on the program. I know you don't speak necessarily on behalf of all Indigenous people, but perhaps you could walk us through the discomfort that you understand some Indigenous people have on this day.
I mean, I think it's fairly common, certainly with a lot of younger people. I mean, when you look at what Thanksgiving is celebrating and the sort of typical story of the symbols that were given, about early settlers having this, almost mythical dinner on this land, this first dinner to sort of celebrate the harvest. Basically, it shows a very non-Indigenous view, I guess you could say, of what was happening. Mm-hmm. It makes the early sort of early colonialism look very peaceful and almost like Indigenous people kind of voluntarily handed over the land and resources over to the new arrivals, which is generally quite a whitewashing of what history was actually about for Indigenous people.
Because it ignored the violence.
Yeah, basically, right? Early colonialism was about forced displacement. It was about violence. It was about, we're in the middle of a pandemic now. Indigenous people faced all kinds of disease that wiped out, some say up to a third of the population, if not more at the time. So it was really quite a traumatic time in history where there was a lot of suffering, misery. Nowadays we're talking more about in terms of genocide, in terms of how Indigenous people experience that history. So it's not something we're particularly, likely to be thankful for.
You have talked about sort of the way in which it might now be framed or perhaps reclaimed by the Indigenous community. And this is in the context that long before there was a Canada, there was some version of a harvest feast in advance of winter setting in, but after the crops and things that had been grown for sustenance were made available to a larger community. What is the sense that you have about how this might be claimed or framed today to recognize that pre-Canada Indigenous history?
Right. Well, I think there are a lot of Indigenous people that do this, right? That sort of define themselves in terms of their culture, not just in opposition to colonial Canada, right? Indigenous culture, although there's, certainly many different ones across Canada, but many of them, would share basic principles like this idea of, relationships with all my relations across the land. Now that would include, the soil, the rocks, the land, the trees, right? Everything in the ecosystem that we have as our relations, and that, we exist because of our relationship. So the gratitude for everything that the earth has given us to survive for that year, gratitude for having those that we love around us, gratitude really, and renewal, I guess, of thanks again for a new cycle to be starting again. So those are sort of traditional Indigenous values that would be born, in and around a time like this, prior to the arrival of the Europeans.
So, just sort of going back to this notion, what are things that can be within the diversity of Canada's Indigenous peoples? What perhaps might be done in a concrete way on this day to recognize those long-standing traditions?
Well, it would be nice. I noticed over our neighbors to the south, the United States, called, have today, what used to be Columbus Day, now they recognize it's Indigenous Peoples Day. Mm-hmm. And so for Canadians, sure, they should be thankful and thankful for a lot of things. But one of the things that they should be thankful for is for having, our democracy, this great life, all the land and natural resources, really, that was Indigenous land and resources. And that, in cases across Canada, Indigenous people, and in stories, all across this country, we hear stories of how Indigenous people really reached out and helped the new settlers in this country, how to adapt to the ecosystem, how to learn to hunt and fish in this type of setting. And help set up, the early economy was the fur trade economy, which was again built on Indigenous labor. And then the next year we had the agriculture economy, which was built on Indigenous land. So non-Indigenous Canadians have a lot to be thankful for to Indigenous people.
Because Canada has such diversity and welcomes hundreds of thousands of newcomers every single year, how do you address the nuance of the traditions and experiences that they may have from their home countries, the traditions that they're now learning coming to Canada? How do you strike that nuance in the context of today?
Well, I mean, everybody's going to be coming with their own culture and their own stories for sure. But here they are coming to Canada, a country that we would like to believe embraces newcomers, but that history comes from Indigenous people, right? And I think that everyone, regardless if they're arriving on this land today or whether they arrived, their ancestors arrived 200 years ago, there still is that should be that understanding that Canada inherently, I guess you could say, as one of the founding nations of this country, owes a debt to its Indigenous people.
Professor Romanow, thank you so much for chatting with us today. I certainly appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.